Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the CMI, and each Friday at this time, we bring you news and views on management topics that matter. Now, today, I'm delighted to have as my guest an old friend and CMI companion, Jan Gooding. She works with us on CMI Race. She is also an extremely experienced executive coach and equality and diversity campaigner. She's been the global inclusion lead at Aviva, the chair of Stonewall, and has a 25-year career working across driving change in FTSE 100 companies, marketing consultancies, and the charity sector. So welcome, Jan.
Hello, Anne.
Lovely to see you. And before we launch in, Jan did share, and I feel I must share it with my guests, that she has been featured in the New York Times Bookcase Credibility series. And I believe it's because of that stunning Marilyn Monroe painting behind you from the obvious famous Andy Warhol painting. So congratulations on that accolade.
Thank you. And I wish it was an Andy Warhol painting. It would be worth a lot of money. It's actually just a print. But yes, that was it's a bit of fun because we're all suddenly being zoomed into our home working. And so I think this is quite a light-hearted remarking on whether people think we really had a bookcase before we suddenly found ourselves broadcasting or not. And I was deemed to have an authentic one. So that was a relief.
Well, that's brilliant. Now, listen, Jen, you've been a campaigner on so many fronts, gender equality, racial equality, LGBTQ, for a long time. And what's your view on the progress that we're making, and how do you think COVID has impacted it?
Well, of course, it would be churlish to say there's been no progress. Of course, there has been progress, but I'm afraid it won't surprise you to know I just think it's at too glacial a pace. It's very disappointing for me as a woman now in my early 60s and now confronted with ageism, in addition to all the other isms that I've experienced through my career. I'm very disappointed that certainly on gender, that we're still having the discussions that we're having. There was a woman marching in a couple of years ago in one of those anti-Trump marches, I think, with the sign, "I can't believe I'm still marching about this shit." And that's what I feel. And I have to acknowledge that obviously from Stonewall's point of view for the LGBT community, there has been massive, massive progress because frankly, it used to be illegal to be gay. I know that sounds like a really strange thing to say, but there was state level persecution, and the Equality Act of 2003 has protected so many people so they have recourse if they feel they've been discriminated at work. But I'm very, very disappointed that COVID has put into stark relief the immense inequalities that are still there, and they've landed in quite a strange way. The many of the jobs now named essential worker, and I'm pleased about that name because I think they are essential.
Yes.
We have to notice that they are low paid workers on the main. They're often in caring roles, and they are often people who feel vulnerable. People who work in the people we've been really relying on, they're working in transport, refuse collection. It's not just the NHS, and they've had to carry on working, and they have disproportionately experienced death, loss, and illness. So I think it's disturbing to see just the impact of COVID and which communities have suffered. It is definitely, poverty is a massive aspect of this. So that's very disappointing to see. And of course, it's well documented. I mean, I don't want to repeat what we're all seeing on the news, but women have been disproportionately affected, young people who just can't work, freelancers who the furlough scheme didn't reach. And so there was a weird lottery in a way about the nature of a health pandemic and where you happen to be sitting in your career and in your employment, and completely out of your control. This thing has kind of swept through like a tsunami. So we've got to be very, very alert to that. And I think there is a tendency for those of us who have been privileged enough to be able to work from home to forget that an awful lot of people couldn't and still can't. And we need to be alert to, even the delivery drivers, that aspect of the economy. They've kept going, but they don't have great employment rights. And I think this should be something for us all to think about. Who are our essential workers that we're managing, and are we being fair?
Yeah, it's a great point. And of course, now, with the progress of the vaccination program, the cases are dropping, and we are slowly coming out the other side of the pandemic. What do you think government, employers, and actually us as individuals, what can each one of those actors do, including us, to make progress in this area as we emerge from the pandemic?
Well, we all promised ourselves, didn't we, going into this, that we were going to build back better. That was the kind of mantra. So now, as we start to be able to plan and look forward, here's our chance. What is the big reset that we want to claim? Now, the government is absolutely critical because they are setting the economic environment, the tax and benefit system, the rules, if you like, the regulation. So I think the tone that the government set, as well as the actual policy decisions that they make, is fantastically important. And also, let's not forget that the government are big employers. Yeah. And that's where I think if the last big drama in terms of a seismic shift in employment was after World War II, when women had to go in and man the factory. So suddenly there was a reframing of what women were capable of doing, which was a big dramatic change in opportunities for women. Likewise, I think the government so far, I don't want to be political or annoy anyone, but it seems to me they are not treating the essential worker in the way that we would hope. So just even some of the early signs of the pay freezes they're intending to introduce, never mind the NHS, concerns me, because I actually think the public would have an appetite to see a reset on how we remunerate our essential workers and what their conditions are. So I'd like the tone to change from the government. I think for employers, there's a lot within their control. I mean, clearly, I can remember just 3 years ago, Anne, doing being part of a conference at Aviva about the workplace. And there was this session about the future of work. Yeah. And it was almost like, when people go, can we even imagine in 20 years and what the world of work will be like? And people were talking about AI. And I was trying to introduce the notion of smart working, which we're now all talking hybrid models and all of that. But being smart about where and when people did the work. And I can tell you, we talked about bravely having a few teams pilot it and that kind of stuff. Well, look what's happened. So we have suddenly the future of the workplace is here, and it's now. Yeah. So we must take advantage and be imaginative about how do we, what environment are we going to create in the workplace? And work is important as a place, and people need it. So we need to work through, how does the work, the team and the individual negotiate what works for those three components? Because what I don't think is that working from home is a human right. I think you have obligations to your team, and I think you have obligations to what does the task require, where actually you may not be the office or the home. It may be somewhere else. I don't know. I think it's magical that Nationwide are turning their branches into an advantage to create local hubs and communities. I mean, to me, that's really creative thinking about where are the places where people want to go and work with their colleagues and be with their colleagues and socialize with their colleagues and all of that. And I think as individuals, we've got to speak up. We've got to listen really hard to one another, hopefully be reasonable, and speak up for how it could be different. Come forward with your ideas of the radical, what you want to keep or what you still want to change, because this has been extreme. This is not what anyone designed. And I have to say, I feel quite strongly. I mean, we've joked about Marilyn ended up, kind of making me famous, but it's a hell of an intrusion, the fact that work annexed my home in the way that it did last year. And that's been everyone's experience. We have just surrendered to the life and death circumstances, of course, but there was no discussion, there was no consultation. So I think after the fact now, we've all got to renegotiate what is the workplace and what is the culture we're trying to foster, and how we're going to rebuild our teams and our sense of purpose and mission, and that social side that I think is so important.
And speaking up, I mean, you said employee voice, very important, and finding yours and being very proactive, also when it comes to calling out inequalities. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about your career. Like me, you've had actually it's the term used in the FT was a mosaic career. And I love that. I love that title. A multifaceted career with many pivots. Can you share a little bit about your journey and what you've learned? And by the way, if you have a question for Jan, please put it in the chat. We will be taking questions later. But over to you, Jan. Tell us more about it.
Well, I've had some quite dramatic points of pivot, and people may well relate to them because it covers the full spectrum. So the first time was I was first woman on the board. They'd never had a board member go on maternity leave, and you will be horrified to know that I was fired when I was on maternity leave. People sort of say, how could you let that have happened to you? But it did. Yeah. The opportunity, so that was the drama of losing my job and being on maternity leave and all the vulnerability that you feel. However, the pivot, which I can now look back and claim, was I reinvented myself completely as a consultant. So I started my own business, I found a partner, and the miracle of broadband had happened in my road. And so I was able to work from home. So smart working is something I have been lucky enough to have for nearly 30 years now. The next big change came from working as a marketing consultant. One of my clients, BT, wanted me to come and work for them. So that was a big change, to go from marketing services, because I started in an ad agency, actually to working in a big corporate. And that was a hell of a shock, because actually to be in a big complicated organization with over 100,000 employees and the matrix organization, and I mean it was startling. But I was lucky enough to be sponsored, as it were, by my clients. So I'd worked with them as a consultant, and they saw the potential in me, because that's what it's about. You have to have a sponsor who almost sees something in you that you can do that you might not see yourself. And that's what happened to me. And I ended up working for the chief executive. I suppose the modern job would be like as chief of staff, but I was responsible for his strategic communications. It wasn't a job I even knew existed, but I was seen as someone who could do it. And it was a very unique kind of role. And from there, I spent 15 years working in big corporates. And I think the next big change, which you've already mentioned, was becoming the Global Inclusion Director. And again, I was coming to the end of working for 8 years as the Group Brand Director. And I was feeling I wanted to start this portfolio career, or whatever we call it now. So I had a number of non-executive directorships. I was thinking about becoming a coach. So they knew that I was coming to the end of my marketing career. And actually what happened was there was a row in the boardroom about the lack of progress, where we started this conversation on diversity and inclusion. All the numbers, the few numbers that they had, which was pretty woeful, they were going the wrong way. And so I got the call, would you consider becoming the diversity director? And I have to say, it wasn't imposter syndrome, more like when I joined BT, sort of what makes you think I can do that? But actually feeling that's interesting, because if you're offering this to me, you obviously see something. So I just asked for a couple of days to think about it, because I'd never considered doing something like that before. And my view, the conclusion I came to was, first of all, I wanted to be called inclusion director, not diversity director. So typical marketing person, the badging of the role was very important to me. And I wanted it to make a statement, because I was the most senior appointment that had ever been made in that role. Secondly, I wanted to sit on the leadership team of the HR function, the people function, because I felt the way to be powerful and influential was to be plugged into the system. So I didn't have budgets and staff. By definition, I was going to rely on others doing the stuff in their domains. So I was deliberately starving myself of resources in order to push and influence the day job people to kind of make the change. And the third thing was I wanted to report into a member of the board, so that I knew I had board sponsorship, given that was where the drama had happened. And I just thought, I'm a marketing person. I've spent my career thinking about people's attitudes and beliefs and why they behave in the way that they do. And marketing is all about, can you change people's minds? Can you change people's behavior? I sort of thought, well, I'm as qualified as anybody is to do this. So I went for it. So I suppose what I'd say is we're all capable of so much more than even we ourselves know. And I've just been fantastically lucky in the person I partnered to start my own business, and having the guts, I suppose. I think a lot of women do that. A lot of women of my age, the cultures were so misogynistic that actually starting our own business was the only way we were going to create the culture that we wanted to be in. I don't think it's that bad anymore. I hope not. I didn't expect to have to do that, but I found, wasn't I lucky that I had someone, I was sufficiently advanced in my career. I was on the board, so it was credible for me to start a consultancy, and I went for it, but I had no idea I would ever do that. So I think being open to opportunity is the key.
Yeah, and taking chances on yourself, right? So there's a phrase that somebody used in one of our sessions on which is about women backing, back yourself at 60%, right? That old story that if a man meets, 6 out of 10 of the qualifications for a new role, he'll say, I'm the best person for the job, and go for it. And if a woman meets 9 out of 10, she'll stress about the one she doesn't meet. So what you have to do is put yourself in the way of the opportunity and take it, right? That's what you've done. And it sounds like that's your main advice, right? To those who want to pivot their career, take those opportunities, back yourself.
I also think anger is a useful driver, Anne. I mean, okay. I was pretty angry that I was sacked. I was responsible for 40% of the agency's revenue. It was an outrageous thing to happen. And I discovered after I left that I was the only member of the board who didn't have a contribution made to her pension, because it was assumed I would use my husband's pension, which is pretty shocking. So that, it got worse. So being fueled, I think sometimes when you lose your job, you do feel quite angry about it. And there probably is an element of unfairness. And I think the important thing, the lesson for me in that was not to be overwhelmed and waste my energy on the unfairness of it, but actually to accept that it had happened, know it was outrageous. It has spurred me for the rest of my career to speak up and do my bit and be part of trying to change cultures in the future. So I've tried to make the adversity useful to me and useful to where I did spend my energy. And absolutely. I think, and that's not easy to do. I know that's easy for me to give that advice.
No, but I agree with you, because I, like you, because we're a similar generation, had those experiences of being bullied when you're in the C-suite as the only woman, the first and only woman. And I think that that's a really important insight, to turn that anger into, that adversarial anger into a positive, and actually to turn to make your energy positive and direct it toward change, which is what you're saying that you did. And I very much relate to that, and I do, like you, openly share the story of, my times being fired unfairly and turning that around into trying to help others. I think it's a great, something that we share, and it's a great attribute. Now, of course, COVID has challenged us a lot. We've had a lot of time for learning and reflection. What's been your biggest learning as a leader?
Well, actually, it's been a reminder of something. And again, because I'm a great one for trying to go, what's the negative space learning? Because I think sometimes when things are terrible, one forgets to learn from them. Mm-hmm. So my biggest learning is I cannot believe what is possible in a crisis. I mean, it's unbelievable, the positive things that were allowed to happen in order to respond to this crisis. And when I worked at BT, when I worked at British Gas, and when I worked at Aviva, we often used to say, how come when there's a crisis, all hands to the pump, we can move the earth? And we saw it happen again. So we saw bureaucracy was removed. Mm-hmm. People were given authority. It was delegated down and out. People met more frequently to make decisions instead of setting up steering committees. And, decisions were made fast, and we moved bureaucracy, and we let our teams work out what to do. We allowed we shifted whole workforces to work from home. We solved problems at speed because we had to. So my biggest learning was that whereas before I'd seen that happen in companies, I'd never seen it happen on a national scale before. And what I think is exciting about that, because I'm very concerned about the climate emergency and how it intersects with the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda, because the two, it's the planet and the people that we should be concerned about. It excites me to see what's possible in a positive way, although it was an awful thing that was making us do it. My goodness, when we decide to move, we can. And so I want to see governments, chief executives, no matter the size of your organization, and individuals, we all have power. And it excites me that we need to sort of keep a sense of urgency without the horror of the pandemic.
I think that's absolutely great advice, Jan. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to turn to the first one, which is from Dave. ED&I is a big focus in my organization. What's the best way to present a business case to ensure we can gather data on and embed ED&I more effectively in our strategy?
It's such a great question, and it's so interesting because actually the business case has been made over and over and over again. We are awash with the most brilliant data, but for some reason people don't believe it in the circumstances of their own organization. So when I began as Global Inclusion Director, we had very little data. And even though I would quote Wall Street Journal, Economist, McKinsey, Deloitte, I went and spoke to people we admired who worked at Goldman Sachs and Facebook and the banks who are brilliant at all of this, much advanced with other people. In the end, the way I had to make the case was to attach it to the commercial strategy of Aviva. And the commercial strategy of Aviva, which was to grow the organization, and the way in which we wanted to grow, I attached the agenda of, you can't talk about, it's hard to talk about equality in a commercial context. So I had to park my activism. I had to leave that out the door. So I didn't talk about human rights or just, doing the decent thing. I talked about the fact that we wanted to grow as an organization, and how are we going to do that when our own staff were such a distortion of the marketplace in which we were operating. And I made the case by talking about the importance in a digital economy of intuitive and iterative decision making. So if you say that in the old world where I come from in marketing, you would think there's going to be an opportunity in this market. You would do research amongst that particular group of people. You would inform yourself. You would develop concepts and propositions, and then you would trial it. That's not how we work anymore. We're iterative in much of our work. And so we need our workforce to have good instincts about what we think is going to work, because we want to pilot things and evolve things as successfully as we can. And so if your staff are all white, middle-aged women or men or whatever it is, we've all got our own starting point, and we know for sure there's very few organizations who have diverse workforces. If you don't have an inclusive culture on top, you're not going to hear from all those voices, because there's no point in having diversity without the listening skills and the collaboration skills to take advantage of all those different worldviews and experiences. Yeah, so I think you've got to make the case within your own commercial strategy. What does it look like for us, whoever, for CMI? Yeah. And I've heard you, Anne, talk very eloquently about one of the awful things about being a woman CEO is the first thing people say is, oh, okay, so you're lecturing me about gender. How are you doing, Anne? Yeah. and suddenly, Black chief executives are going to be asked, okay, so how's your anti-racism agenda doing? Certainly, people used to ask me when I was chair at Stonewall, how many straight people work at Stonewall, they would say, rather accusingly. And I was always very pleased to say that 30% of the staff were straight, which people were surprised by, because they didn't expect there to be diversity of workforce. So,
but your point is which is really great for Dave, is you wedded it to the strategy of the organization. You make the commercial case, and that's what I would absolutely, that's what I've seen work. If there's a business case, you'll grow more, right? Make better decisions, but put it in that context.
Yes.
It's really important. Now, our next question comes from Jason. Now, this is about your latest career pivot as a coach. Jason says, hi, I've just started as an exec coach, and I wondered, what was your biggest challenge when you started?
I think the biggest challenge, in all honesty, is getting the customers to coach. And that was very good for me, because it's a long time since I was at the starter, the one who, that awful dilemma of how do you expect me to get the experience if I can't get the experience? And so reaching that point when I stopped doing coaching for free and started charging for it properly was a big moment, and a big moment of taking myself seriously and taking the fact that I was a coach, and that I not only enjoyed it and got very good feedback, but actually that it should be paid for.
Absolutely.
I think the second big challenge, which they will be aware of, is having spent a lifetime, particularly as a woman, being told, have a point of view. You were always told as a woman, speak up early, speak up fast, don't let other people take your ideas and speak for you. If you do the work, try and get in the room. So I'd had a lifetime of being told, have a point of view. What's your point of view? Share your point of view. And of course, with coaching, it's the complete opposite. It's about no one's interested in your point of view. What are great questions that you're going to ask that will illuminate for the person you're coaching something that will be meaningful to them, some sense of self-awareness or an idea about what to do that they hadn't thought of. And so, to be honest, and probably you've got that impression of me anyway from this, I don't lack a point of view. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed relearning how to listen deeply. That's a challenging thing.
So we've got another question here from Lucy. Setting the tone from government is something you touched on briefly. What tone would you like to see them set in terms of the nature of the recovery?
Well, I'm afraid very different to the one we're getting. So I'm pretty depressed and despairing about the tone from the government. How can I put this? I think the thing in terms of big reset from the government, I was hoping was for much greater interest in rebuilding a greener economy. So for one example, I think COP26 is a massive opportunity for us. And I'm tired of hearing about Brexit. That is so last year. I mean, I know it was only the beginning of this year, but it really feels like we're not interested in talking about that anymore. What are the big issues of the day? And there's a lot of employment to be had in the green economy. So it disappoints me not to hear that being described. I want the government to make us deeply interested in our supply chains. So I think as managers, it's not just about how we're managing and leading our own workforce in an inclusive way. We have tremendous influence in our supply chains, and I don't feel them talking about that. And bluntly, I happen to know that this government are quite deliberate in stoking up what they have named culture wars. I mean, that hasn't come from activists at all, and I'm very concerned by the divisive language. You know, if I'm all about inclusion, listening, celebrating difference, getting diverse views and opinions working together, us turning up as humans and maximizing the potential from one another as well as ourselves. And so I have to be blunt. It depresses me, the politics that are going on in the tone.
So more work to be done, and obviously getting more women and minorities into those green roles is very important. So last question here from Aaron. Hi, Jan. Whilst the impact on women and those from ethnic minorities is being rightly highlighted a lot at the moment, how do you think that those aspects can be harnessed more broadly to create a working environment and economy based on total inclusion? You've been touching on that.
Well, I tell you, it was so terrible, wasn't it, when George Floyd was murdered last year? I have to say, I saw it on Twitter in the evening, I think within hours of it probably happening. And I watched the video without realizing what I was watching. And I thought I was going to throw up. So it had a huge impact on me personally before it became the rightly seismic event that ensued. And I think what has been really important about that is, I think for the first time, people have understand the structural and systemic barriers that are particular to racism and to pursuing an anti-racist agenda, that we have to work on the system. And that is helpful for all aspects of inclusion, because it's all about the system. It's the default processes, attitudes, systems. It's not just about unconscious bias, you know, and there is deep work that has to be done on that. And so the thing I'm concerned about, and we've got to be really careful about, is that as much as that awareness has been raised and that understanding is now true, that people don't then go, oh my God, it's so complicated. It's the system and it's structural. And now I'm overwhelmed, and now I become frozen in the headlights. It's not just, you know, it's so much more than, have you got an employee resource group, and are you doing events and the honest conversations and the talking? We've got to make it really materially different. And that's why I talk about what do we mean by good work? What do we mean by fair pay? What do we mean by potential? Because we don't talk enough about how do we recruit and promote genuinely on the basis of potential, as I've described, I've been lucky enough to have in my career. How do we just get way more imaginative? And it's an everyday thing. Yes. Everyone who's managing, whatever your sphere of influence is, you can make a difference, because there's things to be done every day. Every meeting you go to, do you make sure everybody's heard? Every time there's a promotion or an opportunity to recruit, how is that done? When you see other people get promoted and you think, how come they got the job? That's all very mysterious. You know, was there a process? Was it open? How did that happen? You know, we've got to work on the system, not just sit in the conversations.
Well, so use your voice, speak up and change, and try and do it every day is really what you're saying. and very wise words indeed. Well, Jen, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I've really enjoyed it. Always a pleasure to see you. And if you've enjoyed listening, please consider joining us at CMI. You can find out how to do so in the chat. Thank you all, and I'll see you next week. Thank you, Jen.
Yes, and thank you for the questions. They were wonderful.
Great questions, always. Thanks.